Hi, everyone. I'm Spencer Pauly here with the Center Square's investigative reporter, TJ Martinell, and we're here to discuss his recent article on the Washington State Economic and Revenue Forecast Council's latest revenue forecast, which anticipates the state having almost $900 million less coming in than previously projected over the next 4 years. All right, TJ. Well, let's just go ahead and start with, can you just walk us through what led to this latest update? That's a shocking number there, 900 million.
Well, what's crazy is in June, the forecast showed that the state was going to run out of money by 2027. And for people who want to keep track, record revenue levels, which is complemented by the largest tax increase in state history, what's compounding it is unprecedented spending by the state. And this belief that, by the time we actually have to pay for it, revenue will keep going up. Because if you look at any kind of graph or chart historically, our revenue growth has completely exploded in the last 12 years. So the state has enjoyed unparalleled economic prosperity in terms of revenue growth for the state. And so they're about to run out of money in June. And now they're saying, by the way, you're going to get almost $900 million less on top of that. So they're in a bit of a pickle, to, use baseball jargon.
So what's the root causes of this? What we're seeing is, quote, the worst budget crisis ever. I know, because you mentioned it before. You mentioned it before, but yes, the state already had that whopping $9 billion tax increase passed in the 2025 session. So here we are again. I think from your story, you said we're talking federal administration efforts, including tariffs, right? But there's more to it than that, right?
So yeah, that's the funny part. I'm sure that there were some people gnashing at the teeth when the chief economist for the Economic Revenue Council said that we really haven't seen any price increases due to tariffs yet. Mm-hmm. So you'll note that when Bob Ferguson, our governor, put out a press release statement on social media lamenting the loss of anticipated revenue, he didn't mention the tariffs. He said, he goes, additionally, we're dealing with the one big beautiful bill. We're dealing with the Medicaid stuff, but he didn't mention the tariffs because the state's own chief economist is saying it hasn't impacted our prices yet. So that for people who are hoping to blame the situation on Trump's tariffs for our economic downturn so far, unless something happened. Now, granted, there was a lot of importing that went on before the tariffs took effect, so we might see negative consequences in the months to come and going into the legislative session. But if that doesn't pan out, that's going to be really difficult for lawmakers to try to find something else to blame other than the incredible spending levels that we have.
There is one thing that your story mentions, and that's residential construction permits, and they're down to 2013 levels. Now, the way I look at, when we're looking at construction permits, especially residential, it means we're not really developing much in this state, right? We're not seeing growth, as I would phrase it. And so you note that Chief Economist Reich noted that this residential construction permit affects about 20% of taxable sales. So can you explain how this slowdown in housing is rippling through the revenue streams?
Yeah. So housing permits hit their, I think, all-time high in 2021. Mm-hmm. They had been increasing more or less from 2013. So it was going up. And then COVID obviously shut everything down. And then suddenly all these permits went on in 2021. Since then, it's plummeted and it's down to a much, much smaller number. Like you mentioned, 2013 levels. And this is the problem that I'm seeing, and I'm looking at it from a different story. But for people who, if you look at the historical housing prices in Washington State, the 2008, 2007 housing crisis, it affected other areas more than Western Washington. We hit our rock bottom in 2012. That's when housing prices fell to their lowest numbers. In 2013 and 2014, I was a reporter over in Kirkland in 2014 and 15 when the housing was starting to get a little, when houses were selling for $600,000 instead of, $300,000 in Western Washington. I mean, there was a point when in 2012, you could have bought a home in Bellevue for under $300,000. So the fact that
times have changed.
Yeah. Needless to say, you're old when you remember when housing in the Seattle area used to be affordable. So I think it's hitting the revenue streams pretty hard. So the question for lawmakers is, they talk about affordable housing. Well, there's two different types of affordable housing. There's affordable housing that's made possible by making it cheaper for them to build homes. State subsidized housing is a separate issue. So, but this is hitting their revenue streams. Like, this is a significant amount of money. And this is what was padding the state's coffers for so many years, was all these permits that would come in. So this is, and then and if there's no house sales, then you get the no real estate excise tax revenue, which is also, at least for the commercial side, has fallen back down to prior to when they changed the flat rate. So, I mean, what we might be witnessing is slower growth in terms of population, or people are just not buying new homes, or something else is going on. But I think we need to stress with this whole budget thing, we are not technically in a recession or in a depression. So you had all this on top of, say, the government starts cutting funding for stuff that they now have to either don't spend money on it, or you got to come up with more money to pay for it. Mm-hmm. But if you have a recession on top of that, you could have a massive, massive fiscal crisis. I think I've been saying for a while that the 2026 legislative session will be one for the history books, and I'm becoming increasingly more prophetic than I ever anticipated.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a very interesting TJ.
I mean, because what you have is a lot of systems and things in place that are dependent on ongoing government spending. And if they have to cut, these people, these organizations, these entities, whoever it is, they are going to fight like their lives depend on it to keep the spending. And because their livelihoods literally depend on the government spending this money. So, and they've built lives around this over the last, how many years. So on top of that, but then you're going to have lawmakers proposing new taxes, because they're already saying that they're looking into that. So it's going to be a really interesting fight between the private sector, who's probably going to come out guns blazing during the legislative session to prevent any new taxes, and people who are benefiting from what many people would describe as unsustainable spending levels by the state.
Yeah. And, I think you had in your story mentioned what Governor Jay Inslee did last year. And that was freeze funding and trim expenses. And that's what some state officials mentioned, right? They call that out for Governor Ferguson to do. Now, meanwhile, we have OFM Director Catherine Chapman emphasizing the ongoing efforts for savings and efficiencies. Now, do you think these measures go far enough, or will there be more drastic action needed when we look at the next legislative session?
I think that you're going to see, like I just mentioned, a big titanic struggle between people who are in the private sector who are saying we're being taxed to death, and your taxes are directly causing the drop in revenue. And then you're going to see people who, I think it's objective to say they don't live. If you work for the public sector, you don't have to worry about turning a profit. You don't have to worry about a lot of things that people in the private sector have to do. So they don't live in the same reality. They live in a reality where the only thing that they know is that their livelihood is dependent on the government spending money. And if they cut spending, then they either don't get as much money or they lose their jobs. And what they don't seem to understand is that their jobs and their livelihoods are made possible by the private sector being taxed and having to pay taxes. And so it's almost the, killing the goose that laid the golden egg type thing. And are they going to realize, we need to lay off the private sector and encourage greater economic growth? We need to streamline regulations. We need to make it cheaper to do business in the state, if for nothing else, our own survival in the public sector. Because if you have a $30 billion shortfall, no amount of taxation is going to get your way out of that. And if they tried to, I would speculate the tech sector would basically instigate basically threaten to uproot and move to another state, I think is what happened. Because that's something that really emphasizes the tech sector is what's been driving the growth in the state in terms of economic prosperity, but also revenue. So other industries have not grown like that. The aerospace industry hasn't really been growing like that. The manufacturing hasn't been growing. So you have one industry that's really keeping this propped up. So what happens when they decide to uproot and move to another state that's cheaper? The cost of living's lower, tax rates better, healthier and friendlier business climate.
You're starting to see more of these tech companies, maybe these startups and whatnot, move down to Texas, where the tax system is not as cruel. I guess I should say to our states. But I'm looking at a local level. I cover Seattle, and we have the Jumpstart payroll expense tax, and we have the social housing tax that all targets our big tech companies. We're talking Amazon, Meta, Google, all of these companies that brought in so much money to Seattle, but also the state. Now, with those local, go ahead, TJ.
Well, the problem is that there's this presumption I sense from a lot of policymakers that under no circumstances will the tech sector ever leave. And what we've seen, and I mean, you've heard lawmakers propose a wealth tax, and they said, if you do this, then billionaires are going to just simply move to another state where they already own a home. And the lawmakers say, well, basically say that's a really mean thing to say. And lo and behold, Jeff Bezos uproots and goes to Florida. And by doing so, denied the state hundreds of millions of dollars when he sold his stock. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that where there's this lack of understanding how people respond to incentives. And it's going to be a massive gamble, because at some point somebody's going to make an executive decision to say because there's also the long-term investing. As a business, you want to do make long-term decisions. You can't do that in a state where every session is this just complete free-for-all in terms of what could come out of it. So, now we have a capital gains tax on stuff, and they're messing around with that. What happens when they start adding other things and we lose? There's just no incentive for people to remain in Washington state if you have a certain amount of money. And on top of that, the tax burden, tends to fall in the middle class. So then they start leaving. So it's this really weird situation of whether or not lawmakers are going to say, you know what, the spending levels are not sustainable and we need to make cuts, and we need to cut areas that are just, these are not necessities. These are, they're discretionary spending, and we just don't have the money for it anymore.
Well, TJ, the last question I'll ask you here is just about the upcoming November forecast. Now, are there any hints about how that may go? Could we possibly see another decrease in expected revenue?
Yeah, it really, there's national events as well. Because there's two different things that Washington state could have. It could have a state-centric recession where the state-centric economy doesn't do well. Or we could have something occur at the national level. We could have some sort of foreign policy incident. Today, all the top military brass is being summoned, I think, to the Pentagon or somewhere for a meeting. We could have a war going on. That could cause energy prices to spike, just all sorts of stuff that could go out of control. And so it's insane. It's really remarkable that we're facing a fiscal crisis at a time when Washington state has been bringing in more money than ever before. And I imagine that this decades long progression of increased revenue is about to end. And, all things come to an end, and things that can't go on forever don't. So the question is Washington state facing that decline? Have we reached the peak revenue levels?
Question will linger for a bit here, TJ. We shall see. But thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about your story. For those of you who want to watch or read his article, it's available on thecentersquare.com. And until next week, this is Spencer Pauly. Thanks.